Let's talk about some of the things in the yellow zone. These are things that could have gluten in them but don't necessarily have gluten in them. And so, and some of these don't have gluten in them, but people still react to them anyway. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So let's look at dairy. This is a question I get all the time is dairy gluten-free? And the answer is, if we're talking about, cow or goat or sheep, the answer is nobody's really studied these aggressively to say, yes, 100% sure there's no gluten in dairy. Here's why I say that. We come down here to this bodily fluids here. One of the bodily fluids is breast milk and breastfeeding mothers. And what we do know, we have studied this in humans. So in humans, we do know that there is gluten in breast milk if mom eats gluten. So if mom is eating gluten and the baby's gluten sensitive and the mom is feeding the baby, we know gluten is going to be showing up in that breast milk, potentially creating some problems. Now, I've seen cases where kids had colic or excessive gas and bloating and other irritations, right? Chronic diarrhea, things of that nature, where mom was eating the gluten and the baby was reacting to the gluten from the breast milk. Now, I'm not saying don't breastfeed your baby, but what I am saying is it's always best to know whether or not you need to be gluten-free. Now, because we know there can be gluten passing into breast milk, we have to ask this question with these other types of common human dairies. So we don't know. My advice is, generally speaking, the first 6 months of a gluten-free diet, I always encourage people to go dairy-free as well for several reasons. One, we're not 100% sure whether or not there's gluten in these. Nobody's really adequately studied this, in my opinion. Number two, there is a protein in these dairies called casein. Now, this is true, that casein cross-reacts with gluten. What does that mean? That means that your immune system can confuse casein for gluten and react to it, even though technically it's not gluten. And this is very, very common in gluten-free newbies. So this is why with dairy, again, avoid it for at least 6 months. If you want to try to reintroduce it back into your diet after that point, you can give it a go, although just my experience speaking here, most people that try to make that reintroduction do poorly with it unless they're adding in a special type of dairy called A2 dairy. A2 dairy has a different type of casein. So the casein in A2 dairy is different, and it's not quite as inflammatory as A1 dairy, which is what most dairy products in the world are made from. And it has to do with the genetics of the cow or of the animal. So again, dairy, cautious, be cautious. That's why it's here in the yellow zone. Now, eggs is another one that we get a lot of question about. If the chicken eats grain, will the eggs contain the grain? And the simple answer is no, it won't. The chicken will not pass gluten from its diet into the yolk or the white of the egg. And this has actually been looked at. Now, that being said, there are anecdotes, and I hear a lot of them, probably from many of you have reported that when you eat from chickens that are grain-fed, when you eat those types of eggs, you don't feel as well or you don't do as well. There could be numerous other reasons why that's the case. One of them has to do with when you're buying eggs in the grocery store, and let's say you're buying regular eggs and you're not buying organic eggs. So one of the things that you may be getting exposure to in those eggs is glyphosate. Now, glyphosate being the chemical that's sprayed on grains very commonly twice before they're harvested. So, if you've got chickens, if the chicken farmer is feeding his chickens genetically modified grains that have been sprayed with glyphosate, that's going to find its way into that animal, but also into that animal's eggs, and that may be one of the reasons why you're reacting. But there's technically, There is no gluten in eggs. But albeit many people trying to go on the gluten-free diet originally feel like they're reacting to eggs. So just, again, that's why this is on the yellow zone, the precautionary zone. Now, the other thing we have here is condiments. Condiments commonly contain additives, fillers, or other ingredients that are grain-based. Perfect example here is soy sauce. If you ever use soy sauce in your cooking, most soy sauces, this is the irony here, is the number one ingredient in most soy sauce is wheat. And so a lot of people don't even think that, right? They don't even realize it. And again, this goes back to why is it so important to look at labels? Because if you're not reading the ingredient list, you can really get hammered or glutened, so to speak. Now, other condiments can contain gluten as well. I've seen mustards and mayonnaises and other types of sauce contain fillers like MSG, corn syrup, and other grain-based things that we would want to try to avoid. So read your labels carefully and avoid them appropriately. Now, also we've got soaps and shampoos on this list. Now, there's an argument with soap and shampoo, and that argument is that if gluten is in the soap or the shampoo or the lotion or the cosmetic, can it actually pass through the skin? And the geeky scientific answer that most will give you is no, it can't, because the gluten protein supposedly is too large to penetrate through the skin. Now, the answer I'm going to give you is yes, it absolutely can, and especially this is true if you have an inflammatory skin disease. So if you are struggling with an inflammatory skin problem, something like eczema or psoriasis, these types of conditions, we've all heard of leaky gut, or if you've watched me for any length of time, you have, right? Leaky skin is a thing as well. Remember, your skin's an epithelial barrier. Think of your gut as skin that folded inside when you were developing. So it folded into a tube that created your GI tract. Your skin is actually, your gut is an extension of your skin. You can have leaky skin as well. And so, maybe when skin is super healthy and strong and you don't have any cuts or scrapes or lesions or inflammation, but when you've got damaged skin and you're using, for example, one of the common ingredients in this is oatmeal. Avenin, to be specific, if you see that term avenin, that's oatmeal, that's oats. And so these products, can be problems. I see this all the time, and especially in young kids where parents are using like an oatmeal type of lotion, and the child is gluten sensitive and they already have eczema, and they're trying to use this oatmeal lotion to fix the eczema, and they're actually exacerbating it and making it worse. So I would say that, if your skin is super healthy, no cuts, no scrapes, we could argue scientifically that gluten might be too small to penetrate through the skin, although I would still argue yes in this way. There are numerous things when we apply. Remember, your skin, it's not just a matter of whether the protein is too big to go through physically, because your skin is an organ that breathes, right? So your skin, just like your GI tract, absorbs what you put on it. And to me, common sense goes a long way to say if the skin inside of your GI tract becomes inflamed as a result of exposing it to gluten, then the skin on the outside of your GI tract very possibly could also absorb that very same gluten and create a problem. So I would say read your labels very carefully and avoid soaps and shampoos that have any of those hidden terms. Again, that article just below where you can find out all those different terms and names that sometimes get put into products that don't obviously say gluten. Then we have instant teas and instant coffees. Now, tea and coffee by themselves are gluten-free, but what happens a lot of times is, and I mentioned malt earlier, malt can be found in some of these instant blends, and then you also can get very commonly wheat, and wheat starch is sometimes added. So if you've, this is especially true of coffees, more so than teas. If you've got loose leaf tea, you have nothing to worry about. If you're just grinding your own coffee bean, you don't have anything to worry about. But it's the instants, the ones that are crystallized or powdered, and you stir the hot water in and you stir it up and it dissolves. A lot of those will contain grains, so just read your label. Be very careful about that. Is chocolate gluten-free? Question comes in a lot. You notice we put it in the yellow zone, meaning you have to be careful. It's not 100% that it does contain gluten, but it's also not 100% that it doesn't. The biggest ingredient that gets put into chocolate is wheat. This is very, very common. They'll dust chocolates with wheat. Sometimes they add wheat to the actual chocolate itself. It also contains malt. Of course, malt is a derivative of barley and is something that you definitely want to avoid. So when it comes to chocolate being gluten-free or gluten-full, you've always got to read the ingredient to make sure that the chocolate you're buying doesn't contain any fillers that are gluten-based. Another really big one is your vitamin supplements. Huge contamination. First of all, there's a major cross-contamination issue because a lot of the manufacturers that make vitamins, they don't just produce vitamins, so they will produce other things in their factories, and so they're producing and grinding grains like wheat, barley, rye, etc. And sometimes those end up in terms of cross-contamination. So there's a potential for cross-contamination as an issue. Now, the other thing you have to worry about is sometimes it's not cross-contamination at all. Sometimes it's the fillers that are being put into these products. You see a lot of wheat-based fillers. Oftentimes one of the big ones that you'll see, and even though rice is labeled gluten-free, you'll see rice powder as a filling agent, and there's several reasons why I'd want to avoid rice. Number one, rice has been shown in a number of studies for people with inflammatory bowel problems to cause persistent inflammatory bowel. So we don't want to take a supplement where we're trying to benefit our health, where we're getting this rice gluten called orzo in, and it's causing a persistent inflammation in the GI tract. But two, rice is oftentimes contaminated with lead, cadmium, and arsenic, very toxic metals. And so if your product has that as a feature, again, you're trying to help yourself with a nutritional supplement, but you end up accidentally or incidentally hurting yourself, even beyond the rice or the gluten-based fillers, but through the heavy metals. And then the last thing on this list is cosmetics. This is another big area where you're going to see a lot of grain-based items going into cosmetics. Now there are, and where we have to be careful. I was saying earlier that soaps and shampoos, as someone argued that they can't absorb through the skin. With cosmetics, look, you're putting the stuff on your eyes and you're rubbing your face, and so your eyes, you have a fluid that surrounds your eye, and you're rubbing that stuff, potentially getting it into that fluid. You also put cosmetics on your lips, and so you lick your lips, and then that goes straight in, that goes into your oral cavity, and now again there's an absorption issue. So lipsticks would be another example very much of cosmetics that could be poisonous to you, chapsticks, lipsticks, etc. So you've got to read your ingredients and make sure again that they don't contain any grain-based items.